Welcome back, everyone, to another wonderful episode of RoomPack's ResEdChat podcast. If you're new to the show, every episode we feature a variety of topics of interest to higher education professionals who work in and with university housing, residence life, residential education, whatever you might call it. But if you're following along with this year's episode so far, we've brought on a lot of folks that are kind of looking at assessing the curricular approach, how we're sort of implementing it, and we're kind of tangibly living it out every day in residence life departments all across the country. So this episode is in that vein, a little bit of a different angle, but we're really excited to be able to kind of bring very sort of tactical episodes about the ways that folks are implementing the curricular approach at their institution. So we will get right to it. Chris, if you want to introduce yourself, give a brief introduction of your background and how you got to be where you are today.
Excellent. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chris Arellano-Fryer. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Assistant Director for Residential Education at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. As the Assistant Director, I am tasked with overseeing the implementation and assessment of our curricular approach, which we call the Compass. I also work with our special interest housing, so food co-ops, substance-free, non-traditional age students, and affinity housing. And I supervise two amazing area directors. I also went to Smith. I'm class of 2009, where I studied art history and African studies and was a house community advisor. That's what we call resident advisors. And I actually come out of religious life, not residence life. After graduating from Smith, I worked as with the Christian Fellowship on campus under the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life before I pursued a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, where I concentrated in women theology and gender. Post Princeton, I was a high school, college, and hospital chaplain. And in the fall of 2019, so just before 2020, I returned to Smith as an area director with Residence Life. Then approximately 1 year ago, I'm coming up on my year marker. I was given the promotion to assistant director. So my passion, even through religious life into residence life, my passion has always been college students, their development, kind of their holistic well-being, and then planning curriculum for them has always been sort of an outreach of that.
Amazing, yeah, and such an interesting background. I'm like tempted to be like, oh, I want to like ask him a question about some of those things. There. Yeah, yeah, that's great stuff. Yeah, and I think just that you sort of acknowledge it, like, kind of that common thread between like these very unique and different roles that you've had. But I think I know something that we've kind of started to explore a little bit on this show is the idea like a curricular approach. Sort of segueing from that is like a very uh, it is and can be, depending on where institutions are at, like a very multidisciplinary, like cross-functional kind of thing. Like I think it did have a lot of deep roots in sort of residential life, obviously, which is like a very big part of the student experience at any institution. But seeing kind of how it's expanded and evolved, and whether that's in very kind of nuanced ways within sort of how it shows up in residence life, or the other aspects and areas of student affairs and student support and student engagement, all that kind of stuff. So what we're going to be talking about today, though, just to give kind of a quick plug too, like this was something that I believe you presented on about at the recent ICA conference, the Institute for Curricular Approach. So obviously we've talked about that event a lot on this show. We'll continue to, because I think it is just a great opportunity for folks to be talking about things like about what we're talking about on this show of how folks are kind of coming at the curricular approach, living it out, kind of testing hypotheses of how best to create really supportive learning environments for their students and their residents, and also how they're assessing that learning, all that good stuff. So I know what we're going to be talking about here today, though, specifically is a newsletter campaign. So I will not kind of get too ahead of myself, presuming or assuming anything. Can you explain a bit about this newsletter campaign and how it came to be?
Sure. So our curricular approach, we started in January 2020, obviously not knowing how much the world and college was going to change in the coming months. We met with Keith Edwards and developed our learning goals and outcomes, and then identified some strategies that we wanted to use on campus. One of the proposed strategies was a newsletter. Other departments had them. Particularly once we went remote, we were looking for more ways to engage students. and any kind of like self-directed learning or um, remote avenues were what we were looking at. We also, as a department, wanted to be more sustainable. As the department that um, proliferates a lot of information, we would often receive posters that would go up in the houses, and it's sort of an effort to get away from more print advertising. We wanted to be able to give more digital as a sustainability effort. My predecessor, Dana Olivo, who's amazing, um, started the newsletter campaign and did what we still use for the formatting and introduced some of the like initial components. Um, our components of the newsletter, so what we kind of work with for each, it's a weekly campaign. It comes out on Mondays. We have a feature every week, so a different kind of main column. Those are roughly some sort of like skill or capacity building. We do interdepartmental partnerships, so highlighting other offices on campus or highlighting a process that the department is doing, so like room draw or student staff selection. Our features in particular are what connects to our learning goals. So that's where they really start to flesh out some of the curriculum that we're doing on campus. So um, we do a health and wellness resources newsletter, which connects to our goal of integrating wellness into regular practice. We do a newsletter on roommate conflict, which connects to our engagement and wanting students to be able to demonstrate multiple methods to address conflict. Um, so that's sort of the main like body, and then some other sections that I have introduced this year are an engagement question. So this is where we've started to do some assessment with the newsletter. So it's a question that has to do with the theme of the feature. So, campus resources, for example, we would ask them, what resources do you access or hope to access on campus? That becomes useful information, I think, for other departments on campus to see, like, okay, students really access academic services. They really want access to the Shot Center. And so I think it helps us um, be good partners and good stewards with information that we're gaining and to be able to partner with other departments in that way. We have what's called Compass Corner, which is what else is going on in the campus that week. So it's sort of an advertising avenue to let students know like what meetings are happening and conversations that are going on and bulletin boards and that sort of thing. We include our social media content, so cross promoting social media with the newsletter. Information sharing. So, one of the interesting, as the newsletter has grown in recognition, other departments have been sending us more content that they want shared out. So, we always have a section of like flyers and different, like what's going on campus, different like programs or events. And then a chance to partner with us on social media. So that's sort of how the campaign itself is set up, and then like what I work on every week.
Yeah, I really appreciate that sort of full explanation. So I'm hoping and imagining folks are sort of like seeing this in their mind's eye of obviously just such a kind of robust resource there that's coming out on a consistent basis. People can kind of rely on and expect it, and that uh, it is one of those things where I feel like email is sort of having like it's like renaissance and stuff. Like I've seen a lot of folks like offering workshops and just sort of like really acknowledging that obviously it's such a ubiquitous kind of like utility and the digital age. Obviously we all need email to be able to do everything else that we do. Like we choose whatever social media platforms we might prefer and how we sort of show up in those spaces, but like email is so fundamental. And if you're sort of kind of wholeheartedly embracing it and like really optimizing what you're sending, what you're putting in it and stuff like that, it's like you can get some pretty good results. And so I think that sort of acknowledgement and just sort of like respecting the medium, like you're really trying to like put something together that is full of a lot of kind of relevant information and presented in sort of a user friendly way and everything. But So I think that's great because I think like all the stuff you're listing off, it's like, yeah, there's usually the things people are like, oh, I don't know what's going on campus. Oh, I didn't even know like, these things exist. And if you're just sort of like, you know, serving it up consistently, like directly to them, like because students, I think we've seen like they get just so much noise, so many emails, like just kind of haphazardly from a lot of random people. Like it's just not intentional. It's not, you know, kind of curated, like it's not like kind of thoughtfully done. It's like, oh, I want you to know about this thing. Like, it's not something that you maybe necessarily need to know, but I just want to like, I want to tell you. And that's been like a dichotomy I've seen like folks sort of be like, that's like the first sort of step of like, you're trying to rein in some emails. It's like, is this something I want to say? Or is this something students need to hear? Like, because the idea of just like, if everybody has this sort of power to like email everybody, it's like, we've seen that it often, I think, gets abused. So like, it's like, all right, well, let's try to like, if we want to send something, let's try to like pull it together and like, from what you're saying too, like do it in a way where you're like bringing stuff together on, relevant topics, outcomes, learning goals versus it being, I'm sure other folks may do something similar, but like, they are just kind of cobbling things together ad hoc as it maybe comes to them or as they think about it versus it being like, okay, this week's edition's about like, this topic and here's stuff that's relevant to that. And, maybe there are just sort of more evergreen, sections by the sounds of it. But yeah, so I think it's a really interesting approach. And I guess as sort of a follow up, just from what you're saying, like it seeming such like a robust email and just trying to imagine sort of the design, like, are you using a particular tool to kind of create and send and like, track kind of the engagement with the emails that you're sending out?
Yeah, so we currently use Mailchimp. It we have discussed moving towards like a college platform, but that's the platform we're currently using. It's I find very user friendly, and it does let you track like open data, click throughs. Our last year, I believe, our open rate was around 88%, so pretty healthy. And so it let us track that as well. And then like keeps it all organized. I can go back and reference newsletters from years ago and see like what content has been used.
Yeah, and I will say, just like my day job that I do in addition to this is in like the marketing world, and like it is kind of like tragic because again, just sort of the noise that we all live with, in our inboxes and everything, uh, like industry standards for a lot of like for like open rates and click throughs is like pretty low. So the idea of like most people, nearly all of the people who get this email on a regular basis open it at least, and that's obviously like there's so much good information that you can just get through like scrolling, and it's like yes, we would hope that they like click on something like that means like oh they're interested in a resource or interested in an event or whatever else but yeah, I mean if you're getting like above 50% for something like that, I was like that's like incredible, so that's really great to hear. And I think that idea of you know recognizing uh the sort of possibilities, the potential of email as a medium, and then utilizing a little bit more of a sophisticated tool, it's like I think that investment is really gonna pay off just through the idea of like you are more likely to get people to engage with what you're sending, and also you could like verify that like it's going to look better and be better, and we can also know for sure like yep, versus just being like I hope people read this mass email I'm just like sending from Gmail or Outlook or whatever. It's like oh yeah, we know more people read this one than last week's, and we could probably discern why, and oh a lot of people clicked on.
We know Room Draw will be the most popular newsletter because they want their rooms.
Right, right. Like, so I think that idea, knowing like, yeah, like, okay, that's always going to be a popular email. Like, what can you do? Maybe like present some other good information there, or like, oh my gosh, a lot of people clicked on information about tutoring during midterms, or whatever. Like you can sort of like verify some like anecdotal presumptions and be like, yes, that sort of uh, assumption we had is correct, or there's other surprising stuff, and we can kind of follow, you know, um, the lead. Because I think that's something just made me think of like another thing, I like kind of a mantra that I've sort of reflected on a lot is the idea that like students will say a lot of things about like what they want or don't want or whatever else, but like you can't argue with like behavior as like a form of feedback or sort of that thing where it's just like okay, during this time more students were doing this or not doing something, like they opened their emails or they didn't because like oh this is sort of like a busy time like or whatever, and they might be like oh I want this information or whatever else, but like um that idea of like the reality of people kind of living out their day-to-day lives and the behavior that we see of like what they choose to do or don't do or whatever else, like that's like such a powerful form of feedback, in addition to obviously just like formal channels of like, hey, tell us about this, or tell us, um, what you're thinking about things. So um, I will not get too carried away, though. I want to stay focused here. This is great stuff. So I want to talk a bit more about, what you're doing, and like what has the impact been on your residents? Like what sort of feedback have you gotten just like about this effort, like kind of writ large?
As I said, the engagement questions that's been one of my favorite parts of the newsletter this year. Almost every newsletter has either an informative question, so like what did you learn from this newsletter? So asking them like a targeted question like, do you know what office to go to for X? Or asking a more broad question like, what are you most looking forward to in your house community this year? That one, the answers were beautiful, and it was encouraging. And just for me, as someone who works to build house community, knowing what students are looking for and knowing like what inspires them and what they respond to, um, I think is really helpful, not just for the newsletter, but for our work in general. Like, what is it that really sticks with you about house community? Um, so we have both the ongoing, like quantitative, which is like open rate click through. And then sort of the qualitative are these like surveys this year. One thing we do, which I probably would recommend, is uh, the survey winner gets a $30 prize from the bookstore. So when in doubt, reward them. It goes a long way. And so kind of selecting those winners and getting to know them has also been like a very fun aspect of my job the last month or so. Um, I also really enjoy, I work with a small student staff, and I really enjoy getting their feedback as well. So getting some like focus group feedback on the features. Um, the first time I did like a feedback session, one of my students was like, "I've definitely read at least one," and I was like, "Excellent, we love to hear it. Um, love to hear it." So getting their feedback, the two biggest pieces of feedback that I'm sort of have been like toying with. One is a student mentioned that some of the features were really geared towards first years. So, like how to access campus resources, where are the health and wellness resources on campus. It was very much like as if you didn't know any of these offices. And so they wanted to know, like, can you give a 2.0 of this newsletter of like, juniors and seniors, this is what you should look for from this office. And so that was really helpful feedback from them about thinking developmentally, and how upper class students who may have seen some of the topics before, like how are they going to then engage, and like what developmentally is the next step for them. Um, and the other piece of feedback we got was actually um, having students write some newsletters. So we're trying that out for the first time this semester. We have an amazing student who did work with and Rape on Campus and wanted to do a newsletter about healthy relationships. And so working with her to develop like a feature and then a resource for students to use to evaluate if they're in healthy relationships, and if they're not in healthy relationships, what are some resources for um, that are available to them in those relationships and in those situations. Um, so yeah, both kind of the quantitative and the qualitative is what we've been looking at.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that, I mean, because it segues perfectly to my next question, is just sort of like advice, that idea of certainly like bringing students in, I think is really great. And that like just adjustments to, I think if you were to really go like all in on this approach, like if you could just like segment it and literally send like, even just adapted emails to like different populations, different buildings, even like if you're like, okay, like we're, bringing in some like part-time student workers or other people, like if you're like really getting folks to like fully embrace this approach, like just even within like the residence life context, like you could really start to like kind of really target audiences in that way, versus like, okay, all residential students get the same email. It's like, yeah, but I guess, yeah, in a perfect world you could sort of like split it by underclassmen, upperclassmen, or whatever. Like you could try to like start, targeting things more specifically that way. But um, yeah, I think it's really good stuff. I mean, I think I don't know if there's other pieces of advice that you've gotten, based on feedback or other advice just generally on sort of the journey. But because I think any of these things, like it is like definitely, I feel like for me, it's one of those things where you do kind of have to like start somewhere and start kind of iterating. And like that idea of like, well, I mean, we're sending it every week. It can get better every week, like the idea, like we're going to hopefully just kind of bring feedback in. And like I've seen, I mean, definitely a lot of emails sort of embracing that sort of philosophy, I think is like sort of presenting curated information about a targeted topic of like I know one is just sort of like a general daily student success email, like and if folks in the space note like from inside higher ed, like they've been doing that within like the past couple of years, and they always have like a prompt or a question to really invite engagement. Like otherwise it is like, well, if you're interested in the story you're going to click to read more, versus like we want sort of an avenue, a channel to like, like we're curious about something, maybe about a story we're writing or, whatever else. Like there's always just going to be this prompt to like bring people in, answer a question, or to give them feedback. So I think it is just like a smart way to be kind of building not just sort of like an audience necessarily, like, but like building a community. And that's sort of like what you're kind of getting at too, of just um, like you want that sort of environment where it feels like there can be sort of like a back and forth in a sense of like, even if it's just sort of like, okay, this is a formal channel to give my feedback, but then like I'm eventually probably seeing that reflected in like what is being sort of served up here, just generally what these offices are doing, because we've had sort of these opportunities to get feedback and everything. So um but yeah, I guess any other advice, whether it's very technical or otherwise, about like just this effort, because I think um, yeah, it's just a great effort, I guess, and just a great impact that you've been able to achieve. So, any other advice that you might share with folks?
The overall composition to be strategic about when you're working on the newsletter and when it's sort of just flowing. So I work on an amazing team who all write the features. So it's not just my voice that's getting out there. So every week we'll have a different, either an area director, assistant director, or our director writing the feature. Um, and we do the actual composing either in December or May. So at points where we're having fewer student meetings, the students are in finals or reading period. Um, so trying to be strategic about those times that are having more downtime, um, and having folks do like deeper thinking at times of the semester that are less busy, instead of asking them to do deep thinking in the middle of room draw about a newsletter, for example. It's not being strategic. Um, I set aside time every week to work on the newsletter. It's a small thing, but as we all know, our time, it gets taken up with meetings and concerns and issues that come out of nowhere that we could not have predicted, come across our desks. So having that like set aside time that I know is coming, that I'm going to be working on this, so that I also don't feel like I'm working on it all the time. Like I know I have sort of set aside time. Um, Use the gifts of your department. I One of my gifts is editing, so I feel very comfortable like editing the features and like collecting the information and whatnot. One of my skills is not necessarily design. So again, shout out to Dana, who designed sort of the original template, which is beautiful. Um, so I really appreciated someone like her who has different gifts than I do, and being able to like partner together. Um, Seek out input, especially from students, having those like small group discussions about, do you find this helpful? Is this something you would read? Is it something you would tell your residents about? I think having those like focus groups has also helped me know, it's helped me know if this is being effective or not. Um, and then some other kind of just as a self-directed strategy, this it helps engage residents who may otherwise not be engaged, may not want to go to a community meeting, may not want to have an intentional conversation, but um, do want to read and do want to kind of engage otherwise. Um, we've also found, depending on kind of what your strategic plan is, and our strategic plan, two of the findings were students wanted more practical life skills and students wanted more access and support from professional staff. So actually, the newsletter has responded to both of those. In the practical life skills, we have newsletters on like navigating microaggressions or creating healthy boundaries. And so giving folks more of those like tangible, practical skills that they're looking for. The newsletter is a way to assist with that. And then with wanting more connection to professional staff, just getting the professional staff's voice out there through the features, I think has also been a great way to sort of connect the larger Smith community with our department.
Yeah, I think just to sort of bold and circle and underline something you said that really resonates with me a lot is like not overlooking the value of like asynchronous like digital engagement, in any community really, but especially students where like, they could earnestly be like, well, I'd love to come out to like, community meetings or this, that, the other, but like, I've got a busy life, I work and I've got, a lot of stuff going on. But like if I can stay updated on what's going on and maybe I can pop into, whatever events are going on, but just know like what resources are available to me, kind of like just have this as a consistent opportunity to read when I have time, and engage with like obviously there's other manifestations of that sort of like uh I think meaningful engagement that can happen when it like on the student's own time. If you had like you know um Slack or Discord or something. Like some people could be like, oh, I'm like a power user on there because it's like I can choose when I, show up and how I show up versus being like, well, you got to be here at 7 o'clock for the meeting or the event or whatever, and if not, then you miss it. So I think, yeah, it is a great way to sort of honor, the folks, those folks in the community and everything, and yeah, like I said, I mean, just like a great vehicle to bring in so many different like voices, student, staff, faculty, uh, so I think not being too sort of restrictive or protective or precious about like, well, it can only be me. I must do everything. It's my thing, like I have to have my fingerprints all over this. It's like, you've sort of acknowledged like I would love to have help because yeah, like I do not have gifts to do all the things. Like, so let me, certainly just give this space to others and also just, uh, utilize others' gifts to make it, the best it can be. So, as we wind down, I appreciate your sharing of all the great advice. But are there any resources that you'd like to share on this that have been helpful to you, like books, articles, otherwise, anything that you'd like to share as we kind of wind down here?
Resources that I would recommend are really connecting with what's on your campus. So, connecting with campus partners, a newsletter is a great way to do that. Um, we've also connected with our college relations department who will, when we have a new feature, will like look over the feature, edit it for style and content, and give us feedback in that way, which is really helpful. Um, I've been doing some more reading and then working on like accessibility in newsletters. So a resource would be like connecting with whatever your accessibility office is. So things like having descriptive links. So instead of saying like click here, it tells you where you're actually going if you're in case you're using an e-reader. Using closed captioning, using color contrast. So looking at sort of making our newsletters as accessible as possible. And then another great, the best resource is your students, your actual audience. So sharing with your student staff, including it in your presentations, having students write features, any way to engage them further, I think they're our best resource.
Yeah, I mean that's a great way to look at this. Is that you've got your sort of neighbors and your colleagues and folks around you that are going to be very capable of helping with a lot of the different details. And I appreciate sort of the acknowledgement of like the accessibility piece there too, because I think that is like a point where like, you know, I would say that idea of starting somewhere like, and I think tools like Mailchimp and everything else like anymore are thankfully embedding a lot of this like in its functionality. So like what I was tempted to say, and I wanted to kind of couch it in that first, is like, with starting somewhere, don't be prohibited by like a lot of those different details because it's like, anymore the tools will take care of you, and then even just that idea of like uh it may be that you have to at least like get the prototype built and then you could send it over to your colleagues and be like, hey, is there any advice or recommendations you might make around like color contrast and like alt image text or all these sort of things. Like you can be very specific about like kind of checking over your shoulder to verify those things versus like you know and I can certainly empathize with this. Like, it could feel very overwhelming to be like, well, how am I going to design it? Is it going to be accessible? Like, what stuff am I going to put in there? And it's like, ask your students, ask your colleagues, like, whatever. Like, there's going to be people, I think, if you have a clear vision for what you're wanting to achieve, you can make it very clear and likely like fairly low lift ask to sort of like, provide support, provide guidance, provide, even just reassurance or affirmation of just like, well, this is what I'm thinking. Does this make sense? Like, should I just go in this direction? And hopefully, like, kind of gives you a little wind in your sails to kind of get moving forward. Cause I think, this is such a great, uh, sort of supplement to what we've been covering in some of the other episodes around like doing great intentional conversations, kind of the big picture strategic approaches to you know uh, living out sort of curriculum in the halls every day. So um yeah, I think doing something like this in addition to all those other efforts, I think is going to be really powerful, and I appreciate you giving some time to kind of highlight it and talk through all the details of how you've achieved it. And I've always to certainly um connect with everything that you talked about here in this episode. But yeah, just really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.